Right. Good morning, everyone. I am David Salmon. I will be conducting the Caribbean Studies session today. I am a graduate of the University of the West Indies and the University of Cambridge. I am Jamaica's 2023 Rhodes Scholar, so that means I'm currently here in Oxford, and I am the Executive Director of the Jamaica Foundation, that being the foundation that is carrying out these exam revision sessions today. So our objective today is to go over these important questions that are asked in Caribbean studies. But before we head right into the session, I'm just gonna ask you, or just go over some basic Zoom rules. One, please mute your mic if you are not speaking. Two, please be respectful to each other in the chat, especially even when you're asking questions and also responding to questions. I'm letting everyone know that there is no wrong opinion in this group. This is a learning environment, so it is important that we are respectful to each other. Thirdly, I'm asking for persons not to take screenshots of individuals in the meeting or to record any individuals' voices as well. And fourthly, to use the raise hand function or the chat to ask questions. I have shared earlier that for those who might be uncomfortable with asking questions in a public space, you can do so by messaging me privately in the chat, or you can message me privately on WhatsApp. My number is in the group. It is my name, David Salmon, and that is how you can reach me throughout the session. So the first question that we're going over is really the historical process or movement towards independence. As a disclaimer, I selected these questions based on previous examiners' reports and how they shared the responses of students and whether and how, based on the performance of students and how they handle these questions. These questions are chosen from across the syllabus. So the objective is to provide you with an informed perspective as to how to best approach these sessions. I anticipate that the first half of this session will probably run between 1.5 to around 2 hours. From there, there will be a half an hour break, and then we'll go into our afternoon session or our second session for the day, where we'll be looking at the remainder of the syllabus. So this syllabus, Movement Towards Independence, covers political enfranchisement, adult suffrage, internal self-government, economic enfranchisement, and entrepreneurial activities, including shopkeeping and saving societies. It's important to know that your syllabus is your anchor. So that document that you will see, or the book that you will have, will guide you as to how best to go about preparing for these examinations. So this is what it says in the syllabus. And on that note, I selected the past paper 2015, this question, which says, internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean. Discuss the extent to which you agree with this statement, and it is valued 30 marks. The subject report, which is basically the examiner's report that was created based on the compilation of students' responses, share that many candidates who attempted this question seem to have historical knowledge of internal self-government. They were, however, unable to apply it effectively to the question. It was also evident that candidates did not understand that internal self-government was applicable to the British West Indies. Additionally, the subject report stated that also they ignored the section of the question which required them to discuss the extent to which they agreed with the statement. Candidates had difficulty with chronology and therefore focused on the period after independence. Some did not have an understanding of key concepts, for example, emancipation, independence, and internal self-government. And as a result, these were used interchangeably in the process. So basically, the strengths of the candidates, first and foremost, is that they have an appreciation for a general understanding as to what self-government meant in the Caribbean. But the challenge is that they either confuse the terms or mix up the chronology of events. This question not only requires you to have an understanding of the decolonization process, or the independence process, but also argue a specific perspective. In this case, discuss the extent to which you agree with the statement. So how do we go about answering this question? First, we have to look at look at the statement itself. Internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean. So the first step of this introduction is really definition and context. What does internal self-government mean? What does it mean by how did this contribute to the Caribbean? So the first step is to outline the process of internal self-governance. So a general definition, internal self-government, right of people to govern themselves without external influence. This process, importantly, was a precursor, or it preceded independence within the British West Indies. Bear in mind that there are other territories in the Caribbean that don't speak English. So it is important to underscore British West Indies. So for example, Haiti is in the Caribbean, but this would not fall under the category of internal self-government. Similar to the Dutch-speaking territories, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, the same principle applies. So when looking at internal self-government, bear in mind that you outline the situation that you're dealing with. You're looking at the British West Indies, the Caribbean. So you provide the definition of what internal self-government means, and then you look at the context. So in this way, a basic overview is that internal self-government occurred after universal adult suffrage in the different territories. In Jamaica, it's 1944. In other countries, it was a slightly later time. And then you look at what that meant. You saw the creation, for example, of cabinet administration. We have ministers responsible for departments. You saw greater autonomy given to local actors. That's the sort of context. But bear in mind that this essay is not just asking you to describe internal self-government. It asks you to take a position on that matter. So it is essential to mention the processes that have facilitated the development of internal self-government. I will add that there are multiple persons in the region, so examples would not only be taken from Jamaica, but also from other Caribbean countries as well. The first step to internal self-government would have been universal adult suffrage, the right to vote. All males and females over the age of 21 could now vote and participate in elections. For Jamaica, that occurred in 1944. For Trinidad, 1945. For Barbados, 1950. For British Guyana, 1953. And this provided the opportunity for the public to elect representatives that would lobby for the improvement of their interests. It also facilitated the emergence of political parties. These parties would have oftentimes come from trade unions, and they would have led the process to independence within the Caribbean. So you can start to mention the main political parties: the People's National Party, the Jamaica Labour Party for Jamaica, the Barbados Progressive League in Barbados, the People's Progressive Party in Guyana, and the People's National Movement in Trinidad and Tobago. And then you can look at your own particular country and then their makeup. So under internal self-government, the authority of the governor, which existed under Crown Colony rule, that being the rule before self-government, was replaced by elected representatives. You would have a chief minister, a premier or a first minister, and the cabinet controlled domestic affairs within the colony, the exception being foreign affairs and defense. So starting with the 1940s and 1950s, you saw local ministers being able to control education, healthcare, social services, welfare, while foreign affairs and defense would have still been the realm of the British administration. We saw where the examiner's report shared that candidates were, however, unable to apply knowledge effectively to the question. They ignored the section of the question which required them to discuss the extent to which they agreed with the statement. So this is essential to acing these essays. Do you agree or disagree? If so, how strongly do you agree or disagree? Essentially, you must state your position. So, for instance, if you agree that internal self-government was the most important movement towards independence in the Caribbean, then if yes, explain why. So, for instance, with this example, independent self-government was the most important movement towards independence because it facilitated the emergence of political leaders that led to former colonies gaining independence. Or it led to the emergence of governance institutions that facilitated independence. It contributed to colonial disengagement as domestic leaders became more and more responsible for local affairs, or it facilitated independence as Caribbean citizens could now express their dissatisfaction with colonial administration. So basically, if you argue that it was not the most important movement, and you also have to explain what was more important. So, for instance, economic enfranchisement has not been fully realized. Therefore, it could be argued that it's really more economic factors that was most important towards the independence in the Caribbean, such as the establishment of free villages, saving societies, family businesses. So basically, you're looking at what are the factors that contributed to independence or what were the factors that contributed towards independence? They have argued it's internal self-government. Can you agree or disagree? And then basically, you can state your position and expound it. If you argue that, well, it really wasn't, internal self-government really wasn't the most important movement, it could have been the economic downturn in the 1930s, which led to dissatisfaction that contributed to independence. There are different ways to take it, but basically, you should demonstrate knowledge of the process and also have an opinion or an argument to make along the way. So, like I said here, if you disagree, then you can argue that it was the emergence of the trade union movement that was the most important contribution to independence. This was the important starting point, or it is impossible to determine what was the most important movement towards emancipation, towards self-government, as political enfranchisement, adult suffrage, internal self-government, economic enfranchisement, or entrepreneurial activities are basically all aspects of that same process. So there are various ways that you can argue it. So in turn, just as a recap, when examining the historical process of the Caribbean, candidates are expected to have a knowledge of the process that led to decolonization. But then when you see those questions that ask you for discussion or creating an argument, ensure you state a position. So don't just give information. Also show the position that you have and why you have taken this position and justify this position. I like to, when I'm doing this, is weighing the two arguments and then showing why one is more persuasive than the other. These are some of the strategies that can be used to ensure that you maximize on said marks. And before we go on to our next question, do we have any questions thus far? I'm encouraging everyone to ask their questions as well, because that's how we also learn in the process. All right, I see one question in the group that says, how exactly do we link the parties with the question? Like, how would we word it? So if you're arguing that, well, as I understand this question, as I understand your question, if you're arguing that the development of political parties was the most important movement towards independence, then you can say just that by saying that, well, internal self-government in many cases occurred after political parties were developed. And based on that context, it is really important to appreciate the emergence of political parties and the context in which these political parties developed. And these are the factors that was most important to internal self-government. For example, the trade union movement, and many of these parties have trade union offshoots. They came from trade unions. So it was actually the trade union movement, really, that was most important. And that facilitated the birth of political parties and by extension, internal self-government. So that's one way that we can approach that. We see another question, or we see a couple of questions. Let's see. All right, we see, could we mention that we wouldn't have gotten internal self-government without the precursors like political and economic factors and such? Yes, you can do that, but bear in mind that it's not sufficient to simply mention it. You also have to explain it. So, for instance, if you argue that internal self-government is really has more to do with economic factors, then it is important to explain what were the economic factors. You can look at a fall in sugar prices after the 1920s that led to massive unemployment, which led to labor riots in the 1930s across the Caribbean, which thus was the genesis of internal self-government. So it's not just sufficient to state we wouldn't have gotten it if this didn't happen. It is important to also explain what you mean by that and look at the relationship between these factors and internal self-government. I see another question that says, Would discuss not mean in the essay we'd have to consider both for and against? Exactly. You are correct. Yes, you would have to consider the arguments for and against. But bear in mind that the question also asks you to state a position. So you state the arguments for and against, and you weigh which one is more persuasive, and that is their argument. So, for instance, a candidate goes and says, well, internal self-government was the most important factor that contributed to the independence movement or contributed to the decolonization process. Then you explain how internal self-government contributed to the decolonization process. So, for instance, you saw ministers being able to appoint it, you saw greater autonomy, we saw where it was served an important symbolic uh, uh, gesture that persons kind of govern themselves. So it really facilitated the gradual decolonization process. But notwithstanding that, it is also important to acknowledge that economic factors shaped the movement towards internal self-government. For example, many of these political parties that advocated for self-government occurred from trade union movements. These trade union movements occurred due to the poor treatment of workers in the 1930s. Then, link them together. Even though economic circumstances are important or the development of trade unions are important, we can argue that internal self-government would not have been possible if you did not have these political parties that could agitate for independence. So that is really how you can go about doing it. All right, we see another question. Okay, I answered that one earlier. I'm wondering more of how to format the 30-mark essays. Would each paragraph argue on the lines for or against a prompt, including a counter argument and a justification for each paragraph? Okay, great question. Structuring your essays. Make a note of that. All right, so when you structure your essays, you have your introduction. Your introduction provides you the context. You define the key terms or the parameters that you're working with. If you're looking at those 30-mark essays, they generally ask you to make an argument for or against, or to what extent, to what degree. So bear in mind, at the end of your introduction, you have your thesis, your thesis statement, which basically gives you overview as to what exactly is the essay going to be about. Each paragraph, you have a core argument. So if you say internal self-government was most important towards independence because it facilitated the birth of political parties and it gave rise to political leaders that would have played a seminal role in independence. Those are 2 points. So paragraph 1, you look at the emergence of how internal self-government gave birth to political parties. Paragraph 2, you look at what are the examples of the political leaders that emerged and how they impacted the independence process. Then paragraph 3, you could say, notwithstanding that, there is an argument that it is really due to economic circumstances that led to self-government that led to independence rather than internal self-government. So that paragraph, you give your overview as to what are the economic circumstances and why persons have argued for this. But then you also, in that paragraph, counter saying, however, this does not mean that these economic factors were more important because we are arguing, or you are arguing, that the economic factors could have created the context, but it was really the emergence of these institutions, known as political parties, or the emergence of these individuals that really provided the impetus for independence. So that's how you can structure it. Introduction, thesis, you give your context, you give your definition. You have your 2 paragraphs that argue for your point. You have another paragraph that argues what's a counterpoint. You can either maybe argue at the end of that or maybe a separate paragraph that looks at why that's not as persuasive based on the evidence you have previously provided. Conclusion, and then that's how it goes. So how would you tie the conclusion into the question? All right, so basically your conclusion. In this essay, I have argued, or this essay has, or to conclude, this essay has argued that internal self-government was the most important, or internal self-government was not the most important. This argument has been supported by the evidence of A and B, by the evidence of political parties or political leaders, or if you argue that it wasn't the most important, this has been supported by evidence where we see the economic circumstances contributed to this. Nevertheless, my argument still stands because of why, and then you outline it. So basically, ties everything together. So yes, your conclusion will ultimately state your position or reiterate your position. All right. Let me go and answer two more questions, and then we shall head off to the next section. So let me see. All right, seeing as this is a 30-mark suit, would we state our points for and against and in the conclusion we state our position? Yes, you can do that. You can do that in your thesis statement. You can state the arguments for and against, and then in your conclusion you reiterate your position. Or you can state your arguments for, and then have a body paragraph that outlines what's the counter argument, and then restate it in the conclusion. Generally, it's not recommended to use certain pronouns like I, me, we. So to counter that, you can say this essay, or this argument, or this point, or so yeah, you could do that as well. It's generally not recommended. So definitely good point. You can just say this essay argues, or this point, or in this essay it can be argued, or this essay makes this point or makes this argument. And with that being said, I'll repeat my paragraph 1 and 2. So paragraph 1 and 2, basically after your introduction, the introduction is paragraph 1, gives you context, gives you definition. Paragraph 2 is really the first point that you're making to support your argument. Paragraph 3 is another point made to support your argument. Paragraph 4 is the counter argument that you're making. Counter argument and also showing why that may not be as persuasive. Paragraph 6 is your conclusion where you summarize what you're stating, and then you can move on to your next essay. All right, with that being said, it's now 23 minutes, so we're making good time. Let's move on to the next question, which is intellectual traditions. So the syllabus under this shares that under intellectual traditions, you're looking at economic and political thought, including industrialization by invitation, Marxism, dependency theory. And I decided to select this question, Caribbean Studies Past Paper 2014, which argues that, or says, in the 1960s, the dependency theory attempted to explain underdevelopment in the Caribbean, discuss the extent to which the dependency theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. Just a note that I would share with everyone, when you're doing your essay or you're doing your questions, you can underline the key terms. So for instance, you're looking at dependency theory, underdevelopment. Then you see the operation, discuss the extent to which dependency theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century, 30 marks. So automatically you see this is one of those questions that are asking you to make a argument, to make a case. And the examiner's report, and bear in mind that the examiner's report is actually available publicly. So when you're practicing your questions, you can actually look online for the examiner's report so you can see how previous students engage with that question. So that was just a point that I wanted to share with you. So it says, this is what the examiner said. Overall, the question was poorly done. Firstly, very few candidates offered the correct definition of dependency theory, and most could not say who the theorists were. Very few candidates mentioned Sir Arthur Lewis and his Nobel Prize economic thesis of industrialization by invitation, but they did not mention the important elements of the theory as expounded by Lewis. Reference to the Latin American theorists was glaringly absent. Responses indicated very little knowledge of what constituted the dependency theory. Sorry, give me 1 minute, guys. All right. Reference to the Latin American theories was glaringly absent. Responses indicated very little knowledge of what constituted the dependency theory. And the end result was a very weak display of the use of knowledge in articulating how the theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. Some candidates address development and not necessarily dependency theory. while others simply wrote about economic dependence, especially in capitalist countries, but certainly not in the context of what the question required. So, okay. In a nutshell, the challenge students had with this question was basically a poor understanding of what exactly was the dependency theory, how it was useful in analyzing Caribbean economies, to what extent is it still relevant to this day, and basically how dependency theory generally works, and it's a useful take on this theory and how it contributes to development. So, how do we answer this question effectively? One, definition. It's important to identify a definition and the context. So, the dependency theory attempts to explain how economic development of developing or periphery nations was determined by the external influences created by core nations. This theory heavily influenced the development policies advanced by emerging economies or developing countries. Essentially, development theory argues that, let me give an example here. This water bottle. This water bottle is made by aluminum. The aluminum is probably mined from an emerging economy. In the 1960s, it was mined from countries like Jamaica and Guyana. And the raw material of bauxite, which is turned to aluminum, was exported to a country like the United States. And then Jamaica, in turn, would import these bottles, or the Caribbean, in turn, would import these bottles at a far higher rate than the value of the raw material. Jamaica and the Caribbean would be reliant on the demand for bauxite or aluminum from countries like the United States and Europe. They would be the market that Jamaica and the Caribbean, and let me use the Caribbean generally, would export these markets. We would export these products to. The Caribbean then would be required or reliant on machinery being imported for these kinds of to process these metals and to get access to these metals. So basically, what you see then is the whole economy of the Caribbean. These are argued by dependency theorists. The whole economy of the Caribbean being influenced or controlled, manipulated even by the major economic powers, the United States, Western Europe. So that's really the argument of it. And major proponents of this theory include Andre Gonda-Frank, Raul Prebisch, and these were Latin American scholars, and the Caribbean Walter Rodney. It is important to consider that this theory is heavily influenced by Marxism. So remember, Marxism follows this philosophy that institutions, the whole economy, the modern contemporary economy is a tool or an institution that facilitates exploitation of the masses. Marx argues that the whole economic system of production and for profit is designed to take advantage of those who are oppressed, those who are the wage laborers. So essentially, a lot of alienation that takes place, or distance between what someone makes and basically where they are in the production system. Dependency theory fits into that school of thought, as it argues that the current system of capitalism, the current system of development that has really, or the current system of the economy, the international economy, has been geared towards the exploitation of poorer nations, where poorer countries are reliant on these large economies for capital, reliant on them for their markets, reliant on them for investments, and we don't generate or get the value for money from it. So the theory's main premise is that wealthy core nations contribute to the exploitation of developing countries through resource acquisition, taking advantage of labor, and the provision of investments. So in the 1960s, the dependency theory attempted to explain underdevelopment in the Caribbean. The question says you should discuss the extent to which the dependency theory is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. Ensure you state your position. So, for instance, the dependency theory is like extremely useful, or it is somewhat useful, or it is not useful to explain underdevelopment to this day. You have to look when examining dependency, or if you're arguing that dependency plays a very important role. Dependency is still useful in explaining Caribbean development in the 21st century. We have to look at what the Caribbean economy looks like in the 21st century. So this is an overview. Caribbean economic development is heavily linked to core economies, rich countries. The region sells resources cheaply to the core, for example, bauxite, and pays much higher resources for finished goods needed, so example, motor vehicles. Core nations provide capital, such as foreign direct investment, which is needed for local economies to develop, for example, the tourist industry. Most profit is repatriated by large multinational corporations, for example, the large hotels owned by Spanish companies. And if you look at, for example, Jamaica, only 42 cents out of every dollar tourist spends in Jamaica remains in the country. Bearing in mind that Jamaica is the second highest country in the Caribbean where retained tourist earnings are concerned. So you have the Dominican Republic, which is around 51 cents, Jamaica, which is 42 cents, and then every other country in the Caribbean drops off at around 25 or not or less. What does that mean? For every dollar a tourist spends in the region, only or less than half of it remains in the region, while the rest of it goes back to these countries. But yet we're still reliant on these countries for investments, for visitors and such. So that is how you can go about appreciating or understanding what does this mean. If you look at how to answer this question, you have to look at a contemporary example. If you're arguing that dependency is still relevant, then you have to look at not just what it was in the 1960s, but also what it looks like right now. Before I get into this, a point to note. The examiner's report had mentioned Arthur Lewis. Arthur Lewis was a pioneer in economics. He's the only person from the Caribbean to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And his argument was that the Caribbean can industrialize by inviting foreign capital. Sorry, asking you to mute your mic. Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh, yes, Arthur Lewis. He argued that the Caribbean can develop, can industrialize if we invited capital to come to the region, whether it be through tax incentives or generous frameworks for the repatriation of profit. But basically, we get investments from overseas, and this will help to solve our unemployment problem. It didn't work because unemployment still remained very high. Profits went back. So basically, dependency theory emerged in light of that, what those theorists argue was a failed experiment in Caribbean development. If you're arguing that it is still relevant, the case of Guyana might prove insightful, where you see governments give lucrative deals to foreign companies. So in the case of Guyana, it was to attract countries like Exxon to come and invest in the Guyana to develop its oil industry, while a lot of that profit might go back. So for instance, the deal allows Exxon to deduct up to 75% of the earnings from its Guyanese wells as costs before the balance is split between the government and the company. Foreign companies also own very lucrative assets. For instance, the Chinese firm China Merchants Port Holdings is in complete control of the Kingston port in Jamaica, and it is the entity responsible for managing the port. We can also look at the fact that if you're arguing for current modern day dependency, Caribbean economies are also unable to develop local industries or local agriculture due to the importation of cheap food. So there are different points that you can use to argue that dependency is still relevant. So as stated here, it is important that candidates acknowledge the work of Arthur Lewis' industrialization by invitation. The main assumption about the economic structure of the Caribbean is that the supply of labor is unlimited. This results in unemployment. Lewis proposed that rapid industrialization using labor-intensive manufacturing and agricultural development was the solution to overpopulation and unemployment. To facilitate this process, foreign capital should be encouraged, and this would assist in the creation of a local entrepreneurial class, which was what Lewis had argued. The criticisms of this was that the Jamaican economy, which is where one of the major economies that adopted it, this model did grow rapidly in the 1950s, but in 1956, well, rather, the Jamaican economy did grow. Within 1956, the economy grew by 14%, but by the 1960s, the number of jobs created was less than the increase in the labor force. So basically, the economy is growing, but the labor force is increasing much more rapidly. So there still wasn't enough jobs. Local entrepreneurs also furthered the cycle of dependency by importing technology and raw materials, which is a cycle that we can see today where a lot of our big firms in the Caribbean are heavily reliant on raw materials that are made elsewhere. You can look at the fact that reinvestment by foreign capital is also low, and there are reports of abuses in sectors, for example, free zones, where wages were low. We can see this, or I should throw this out to you. Do we see any example of this today? You can use the raise hand function. Do we see any example of this arrangement today of, for example, labor abuses or low wage industries? Any thoughts on that? Yes, true. Sheen is an example of that, but just one thing I'll caution you that even though this is an example actually of it, we don't have, you're doing a Caribbean exam. So I would also suggest that the examples are applied to the Caribbean. Even though you are correct, these examples do exist elsewhere, but when using your examples, look at the Caribbean as well. I'm seeing several examples saying call centers. Yes, call centers are a very good example of this, where call centers are often located to Jamaica. I'm not familiar with call centers in some of the smaller islands, but I know that for the larger territories like Jamaica, call centers are a big part of the economy where you're unable to form a trade union in these call centers, and the wages are comparatively quite low in the sector. So if you're arguing that yes, dependency theory is still relevant, you can use your call center as an example of this. Before I go into the recap, if you're arguing that, let me go back to the question, that the dependency theory, while useful, is not as relevant to the Caribbean development of the 21st century, then you also need to state this position as well. So a counter argument could be that, well, the Caribbean has seen the emergence of an economic system where that cannot be fully explained by dependency. For instance, in the case of, let's say, Barbados, the country, generally speaking, has a decent standard of living and is regarded as an upper middle income economy where the government can facilitate opportunities for the workforce or for the labor force in the country. This would imply that foreign investment isn't necessarily the challenge and that dependency theory is not as helpful in explaining contemporary Caribbean development. You can make that argument, but bear in mind it is very important for you to acknowledge, not only acknowledge, but explain why you make this example as well. Because another counterpoint could be, well, Trinidad and Tobago has achieved a rapid economic growth. It's an upper middle income economy. They enjoy a higher human development index than Jamaica, for instance, and they have been able to mobilize their resources. Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica exist in the region together, so it might not be as influential or persuasive to argue that, well, dependency is a problem, but we see that in Trinidad, the economy has developed differently than Jamaica. So there are different ways you can. So I'm not arguing that you should state or dependency, you go for one or the other, but bear in mind, it's very important that you explain your position on this. So we're gonna head right into the recap. Basically, it was a job overall recap. I'm gonna check now to see if we have any questions. All right, not seeing any questions in the WhatsApp group. Let me go check in the, I know we had a one question very early. Could you please look at the Marxist view and the communist view? I'm honestly unsure if that's the name. Okay, so the Marxist viewpoint argues, as stated earlier, that the whole system of capitalism is geared towards exploitation. Institutions, therefore, exist to exploit labor. So, for example, Marx would argue that the government exists to protect not the workers, but capital. For instance, the government has demonstrated where it will lower taxes and create tax incentive schemes for big multinational corporations to locate to the region and be able even to repatriate or to move their profit, but they are more reticent or they are more averse or more reluctant to actually introducing legislation to support labor. For example, a contemporary example, in the Jamaican case, the Occupational Health and Safety Bill in Jamaica has not passed despite it being drafted for the last 10 years or so. You can look up that example. So what we see, institutions like even the government has been captured by capital interests, and that is why they're not promoting the interest of labor. So that basically shows how you can incorporate the Marxian perspective. Let's see, we see another question here. All right, let's see. So core ex-regional nations are the upper class and the peripheral nations are the working class. Yes, you could argue that basically is the core, basically core rich is the center of the global economy. Periphery, not so much. So periphery is your countries that provide resources, natural resources, but the core. So that's how you can, so that basically is the overview of the dependency theory. Let's see. All right, another question. Is there any Caribbean country that is completely independent of extra-regional countries, as in to the point where said country defies the principle of the dependency theory? Is there any Caribbean country that completely independent of extra-regional countries? There is no Caribbean country that has been able to industrialize without some input from larger economies. If I think the only exception would probably be Cuba, as Cuba from the 1960s would have been a communist nation, and communism would argue for disentanglement from the international economy. But there is a caveat because Cuba would have been supported by the Soviet Union between 1960 and 1990 until the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's not really independent. We didn't really develop independently from international economies. As to what point where it just said the country defies the principle of dependency theory, well, some persons who criticize the theory argues that it is incredibly deterministic or prescriptive, meaning it is a theory that basically presents the argument that Caribbean economies really have no agency or really are not free to do what they want to do economically. And one can argue that that is a criticism because that ignores how economies develop. So economies, generally speaking, do rely on external investments elsewhere. So that is one criticism that you can look at it. If you're asking me, let's see. Can I explain the functionalist view? Okay, so the functionalist view is sociology. It wouldn't be Caribbean studies. You wouldn't have to use the functionalist perspective in this essay. I will just give a brief overview, but bear in mind it's sociology rather than Caribbean studies. The functionalist viewpoint, basically, as its title suggests, argues everything is functional. Everything makes sense. Everything has a purpose to it. So crime has a purpose because you can look at it shows what a good citizen looks like versus what a good citizen does not look like. But bear in mind, though, that the functionalist perspective would not be about, would not be applied to Caribbean studies because that is uniquely sociology based. But basically, just argues that everything makes sense. Can we use only the Marxist perspective in this essay? No, I would not recommend that because uh, sorry. So this essay, what they wanted, all right, so here what guys. What I really want you to demonstrate is knowledge of the theories themselves, knowledge of the intellectual thoughts at hand. And that's why I showed the syllabus earlier. And it shared that you're looking at economic and political thought, including industrialization by invitation, Marxism, dependency theory. Those are the intellectual traditions. You want to show demonstration of knowledge of intellectual traditions. So it's not sufficient to just identify the Marxist perspective. Yes, it can be the main focus of your essay, but simply not sufficient to just highlight this one thing because you're not showing the knowledge that you have. For example, looking at dependency theory, because dependency theory and Marxist theory, even though dependency theory is based on Marxism, it's not Marxist theory 2.0. It does have its unique proponents, it does have its unique prescriptions. Industrialization by invitation, it is important to mention that as well. So not sufficient just to mention one perspective. How would you discuss a question about different races or ethnic backgrounds and cultures and how that helped form the Caribbean in economic development? I can't remember which past paper, what the question, what exactly asked. So, okay, so this is a very good question. I'm going to ask you to leave this question for the second half of this session because uh, we do actually look into that aspect of culture. I don't remember if we did the different races, but um, I will answer this question in the second half of the session where we look at the different examples of culture and whatnot. And another question, could the concept of development be included? I'm not sure what this question means. I'm just going to ask to rephrase. Okay. I'm just going to ask you to rephrase that question. Let's see. Is there a part of the syllabus where we do look at the sociological perspectives on the societal institutions? Yes, yes, to some extent. That part of the syllabus does incorporate, you could incorporate sociological analysis, but I would caution you against writing a sociology essay in the Caribbean studies. So Caribbean studies, the function of Caribbean studies really is to show an appreciation and knowledge of the region. So for instance, if you're looking at different institutions like the family, yes, you can argue that, well, a sociological perspective is very relevant to the Caribbean. You can look at Talcott Parsons' definition of the family and whatnot. But simply highlighting it doesn't show you what is unique about the Caribbean. So, for instance, a Caribbean and family would probably ask you to look at different family structures and things like that. So, bear in mind that your examples, it is important to highlight the Caribbean context in which you're working with. All right, so the final question, still making good time. Wait, before I answer this, let me check one thing here. We have enough time. Okay. So yes, we're still making good time. So the final question that we see here, or actually you can ask more questions because we're ahead of time. We look at would industrialization by invitation be relevant in disproving the sentimental dependency theory? And if so, how would that be structured if one was arguing that the dependency theory was not effective? That's a good question. Let me think about that now. Would industrialization by invitation be relevant in disproving the sentiment of the dependency theory? I'm going to ask you, Akil, if possible, if you can open your mic and share with me what exactly do you mean or what did you have in mind? Are you able to open your mic, Akio?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Good morning. Because from what I gathered, industrialization by invitation is more favorable towards capitalism
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the dependency theory. So I was wondering if someone was to make the argument that the dependency theory wasn't effective in explaining the Caribbean's economical situation, then like if explaining the benefits of industrialization by invitation, like if that would be relevant in saying that no, the dependency theory is not currently effective. So that's basically what I was asking.
Mm. All right. Interesting point. I would say this. When using these theories, it's important to consider the time frame that you're working with. So industrialization by invitation occurred actually before dependency theory emerged. So industrialization by invitation would have been the most dominant perspective in the 1950s and 1960s. Dependency theory really saw an increase in the 1960s and 1970s. So it's a little bit challenge. I wouldn't suggest going about looking at industrialization by invitation to say it proves dependency theory, because when industrialization by invitation was the predominant perspective, dependency theory was still being formed. So dependency theory occurred after to criticize industrialization by invitation. However, what I would say is not to disregard the point, but you can look at contemporary Caribbean development, which might be useful in disproving dependency theory. So, for instance, you can look at the fact that, well, the idea that the Caribbean economy exists in an exploitative relationship doesn't is not a fair description as to the current economic system that the Caribbean that the Caribbean existing. For example, Guyana has natural resources such as oil that they have been used, that they have been able to develop because of investments by foreign capital, such as Exxon. While a dependency perspective would argue that this really traps Guyana in a subordinate position, however, the case of the country has proven otherwise. For example, the government has expressed that they were using the revenues from oil to improve the infrastructure of the state. Thus, it doesn't, and also actually attempting to provide more jobs, because I believe China even did a cash transfer for its public sector workers and increases public sector workers and salaries of its public sector workers. So we could argue that the Guyanese example illustrates that dependency really isn't as accurate in highlighting the challenges of the Caribbean economy to this day based on this example. So you can use contemporary development to illustrate that, well, it's really not supposedly dependency theory, but there could be other factors at play. So it might not be as accurate, which is why the question had explicitly asked you to state, it had asked you to state, discuss the extent to which dependency theory is still useful in explaining the Caribbean. So it could be useful, but maybe not as useful, or it could be extremely useful. So it really asks you to take a more nuanced perspective, not A or B, but somewhere in between. And can I go into depth on the industrialization by invitation? Okay, yes. So what am I saying? Arthur Lewis, which is this gentleman here, argued that the Caribbean in the 1940s has endless labor. Lots of people. Too much people, actually. So basically, the real hope for employing all these people is to get manufacturing. You improve agriculture. Now you make it more productive, more efficient. So that frees up all that labor in the countryside. We then go to cities. Then you develop manufacturing. So these people will be able to be employed in jobs, for argument's sake. So you can, so essentially, though, even though these people, you try to get them into manufacturing, the Caribbean doesn't really have the capital to invest in factories and all of that. So therefore, what you do is you reduce the taxes on these firms and you say, okay, come clothes maker 2000, come to Jamaica for argument's sake, you'll pay less taxes. So just come set up shop, you can import whatever you want for free or with low taxes, and you pay low taxes in general. So come locate here and employ. So basically, industrialization through attempts made by the government to entice these firms to be here. That's basically industrialization by invitation.
Repeat, sir.
I was saying that industrialization by invitation is basically where the government gives tax concessions to people to locate to the sector. So for instance, in today's society, a BPO or a call center can locate in a special economic zone and pay less taxes and be able to import, for example, the machinery that they need, the telephones or whatever the case, or the computers, and pay less. So basically, you are inviting foreign capital or inviting foreign businesses to locate to the country at hand, develop the country, and you're providing incentives for them to relocate to said country. That's basically industrialization by invitation.
Oh, like less tax so them can come in. Oh, okay.
Basically, yes. And yes, you are correct. The dependency theory would explain why we did industrialization by invitation, which is why the dependency theory is used to criticize industrialization by invitation. So yes, you are correct. It is used to criticize it, which is why when explaining dependency theory in the Caribbean, you can't divorce it from industrialization by invitation. Another question, could the idea of economic integration through agencies such as CSME and CARICOM help disprove the relevance of the dependency theory up to the 20th century? Yes, Joshua, you can make that argument. You can say, well, the Caribbean single market economy exists as a free trade zone where local goods can be exported to other Caribbean economies and thus not as reliant on international markets in the United States. Basically, it's really how you explain this topic. And it's now, let's see, should be around maybe 12 o'clock now, where you are. I'm thinking that we can take a break for around half an hour and we can resume the next half of the session. I will be in the meeting room here, so you can ask me questions. And I will pause the recording. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon session of our Caribbean Studies Marathon. And before I go into the next set of questions that we are going to be doing, I will be answering some queries that I got in the break. So the first query that I received was looking at predictions for this upcoming examination. I can't make any predictions on this examination because, well, I haven't seen the paper, but generally speaking, it's not recommended to try and predict what a response, what CXC will set as the paper. However, I will say that based on the questions that came last year, and thank you for sharing those questions in the group, it is unlikely that those questions will be repeated given how broad the syllabus is and how they can ask from multiple perspectives. That being said, it is not recommended that you don't pay any attention to it. So still read over what you are going to say in your, read over those particular sections that would have come last year. But I'm just saying it is unlikely for it to return again. I would share that the syllabus does ask you to learn quite a lot, and it is important that you be very precise with how you revise your responses. There are several Caribbean study guides that I would suggest that you, I would suggest that you have. going to bring up the copy of one that if you don't have, it would be good if you could borrow it. The Collins Cape Revision Guide is one that I found was incredibly useful when I was preparing for Cape. That one gives you good information that's very compact. And if you are in your final step of revising, then the CXC study guide, Caribbean Studies for Cape, is one that I would suggest that you perhaps use. I wouldn't suggest that you buy these books because you'll only be using them once, but I'm sure, or at least I hope to think that there is a classmate that one could borrow and photocopy notes from, or they could use it from their school library. I have not seen these books available online. I did check, but I haven't seen them online. But if there are any particular topics that you would like me to take a photo of, then I can do that and send those pictures in the WhatsApp group. So that being said, if there are any topics that you want me to take a photo of, I'll take a photo and send them in the WhatsApp group, given that I haven't seen these papers online. Additionally, I was asked about structuring essays, time management strategies, how to do last minute tips. I'll go through all of that in the last section. Based on my conversations with you in the break, it generally sounds like people want to know how to respond to the essays rather than me necessarily going through past papers. So I have taken that feedback into mind, and I've altered my presentation a bit to focus less so on some of the questions that I may have previously gone through in previous sessions, and also devoting a section at the end to look at how best to answer these questions. And also, I also took note of the questions that were coming up in the group throughout the session in terms of some topics to focus on. So I'm also just going to go through that as well. With that being said, let's get right into the next half of our session. In the impact of societal institutions on Caribbean people. I know earlier there was a question as to whether we should use sociological concepts in the essay. And this particular question, the next one we're going on, looks at the family, which is a sociological or a topic that comes in sociology. So you can see how, to some extent, there are similarities, but there are also differences as well in how we approach these essays. So the syllabus asks us to look at the impact of societal institutions on Caribbean people, including family forms such as the nuclear, extended, or visiting households. It also asks you to look at education, how has education impacted societal institutions in the region, colonial versus pre-colonial, and in fact, gender. It also asks us to look at religion, including African, Asian, European, derived syncretic, as well as the justice system, police, courts, including the Caribbean Court of Justice and Correction. I believe last year, social justice came on that paper. And I think that may have been a question that has been repeated within the last 5 years. So I decided not to focus on that particular aspect of it and more so look at family, which, as far as I can recall, hasn't occurred recently, and is something that is a interesting topic that you can use to basically illustrate then how to respond to a question that seemed more sociological in origin, especially for students who haven't done sociology. So if you look at this past paper question, it says 3 ways in which the family as a social institution impacts on society and culture in the Caribbean. You note, it's a 20-mark question, so not as intensive as the earlier ones that we did. And the subject report said most candidates emphasize the social role of the family, such as nurturing, caring, providing food and shelter, but ignore the wider role of the family and fail to acknowledge the other functions of the family. Also, candidates fail to acknowledge the changes in the family and how this impacts society and culture. This paper also, the subject report also said that candidates mentioned the popular family types, but failed to mention same-sex families as an emerging family type. Some candidates had knowledge of families, but could have deepened the discussion by citing examples to bring out the arguments, such as the incidence of crime and illegal drug use within the nuclear and extended families. Some full responses were produced on Hindu and Muslim families, particularly in Trinidad, Guyana, and Jamaica. A reasonable number of candidates who understood the question scored high marks. So basically, how do we assess, how do we go about answering this question? One, introduction, look at the definition. So the family is the primary social unit responsible for socializing children in values and norms. Or you can look at it's a group of people usually living under the same roof. Notice I said usually, because we do have visiting relationships in the Caribbean or the single parent household as well. So, but for this case, a group of people usually living under the same roof that are related by blood, marriage, or adoption. We outline the family's roles, including socialization, procreation, emotional support, and economic functions. So we're looking at assessing 3 ways in which a family as a social institution impact society and culture. You can look at different ways that the family might impact the society. For instance, poverty. So families share values and resources that may lead to improved performance in its members in society. There is a theorist, Louis Althusser, who had shared that the family, or rather, when we learn, there is a hidden curriculum as well that is also a part of the learning process. So, for example, having good manners, so how to network or things like that. So it can be argued that one way the family as an institution impacts on society and culture is that it can help to reduce poverty if it encourages the inculcation or the adoption of certain values, for example, a desire for education, or for looking at, let's see, how to create, values such as education or hard work, or factors like that. Equally so, the family can lead to a rise in antisocial behavior. For example, the impact of the barrel children phenomenon. Barrel children basically meaning that when parents migrate, they send back resources. As a consequence, these children who are barrel children might receive resources, but may not necessarily receive certain values, and that like contribute to antisocial behavior. You can look at how the family might work with crime. So you need intergenerational family members are involved in illicit activities. So you have grandfather, father, and son. So look, basically this question asks you to think about or to see how the family as a mechanism might shape the current Caribbean society. So for instance, the Caribbean society is one that is characterized by us, well, for countries like Jamaica, the Caribbean, there's a high prevalence of single parent family structure, single parent family. You can look at how the consequences of that and how that might impact society and culture. In countries like Trinidad and Guyana, where there's a high population of Indians, you can look at how the family works as a socializing institution that may create, or you can see the emergence of the extended family structure. So this one really allows us to reflect on how does the family work in the Caribbean, how that impacts society. You can see other ways, for instance, could be the perpetuation of abuse. So children learn the values that they see in the household and they go and do said, they do what they learn, children live what they learn. You could also see where you see the family can perpetuate cultural norms such as visiting unions, where at least in Jamaica, 45.6% of all households are female-headed, with over 26% of these households containing a male adult resident. So you can see how the dynamics of that might work. So you can go about answering that question. Other factors you can consider include marginalization of individuals in the family, continuation of certain gendered roles, or the continuation of loose relationship with partners. So basically this question, so what you can see is that if you get a question like this, you might be thinking, oh, wow, this is so difficult. How do I assess how does a family as a social institution might impact society? Well, what it really asks you is to think, what is the impact of your family? And you, or what's the impact of your family that your family might have on you? And then think as to, or basically see how that might not be as unique as you might think, but can be broadly generalized to the Caribbean. So that's what that question asks you. I chose this question because it might seem difficult on the surface, but once you start to think through what they're looking for, that might prove to be very helpful. So yes, Sarah, social norms and values within society is one such way that the family might be helpful. It incorporates like primary socialization, things like that. So you can see, while this might look like a sociological question, and in some respects it is, but you can also think on your feet as to how to answer said question, and you will get the marks for it. Are there any questions? All right, no other questions. So let's go into the next element of the syllabus, which is Caribbean global interactions. In this aspect of the syllabus, it asks you to look at Caribbean's influences on extra-regional countries. For instance, one, political issues created within countries of Europe and North America. Well, before I go into this action, I see a question on the previous topic. Yes, the perspectives could act as functions. What are the functions of the family? How do you assess the functions of the family? So for instance, socialization. So to what extent do Caribbean, the family unit in the Caribbean might create certain social arrangements that are perpetuated. So for instance, you have a mother who is a single parent in a household. As a consequence, she might have a son, for example, who, because she has to work so hard to take care of that son might not be able, might not be supervised, which leads to that son potentially doing crime. And by the way, guys, I'm not saying that this is what happens in every single institution. I'm just sort of showing you how you can think through this question. But you say, let's say, for example, that single parent has a son who she's unable to supervise, and as a consequence, then that person might do crime, or that person might develop relationships with other women and have um, loose relationships, meaning unstructured relationships with those persons, which means that other persons might have single parents. So it's really looking at it from the perspective of what are the functions, or what are the roles of the family, and how does the roles of the family contribute to that? Can we say how it acts as a social institution to reduce crime rates? Yes, that is in line with that. So we can mention the family. Yes, that's how you can. So basically look at how the family works, and look at how it works in theory versus how it works in practice in the Caribbean, and how it leads to the development of different cases in the Caribbean. Bear in mind, though, what I will say is it's not that this is not an argument. Well, this is not one of those essays where you have to take a position. It simply asks you to assess. So basically, evaluate or to show how it works or how it functions, rather than looking at it from the perspective of, oh, this is my argument that really the family unit functions like this, as opposed to those who argued functions like this. You're really not just evaluating three different perspectives. So it doesn't necessarily require counter argument in this perspective. In terms of your question, sociological perspectives considered, if you do sociology, yes, you can incorporate it. Bear in mind, you use your Caribbean examples, but not to say that it's not an exam or it's not a question that relies only on a sociological perspective. So if you don't do sociology, then you're also fine as well. You can answer the question. Just ensure that you read what are the different cases within the region that you're working on, and then from there proceed to answering the question. Can we say too that through acting as an agent of socialization, or you can socialize children into a culture of poverty and fatalism, thus perpetuating poverty? Yes, Joshua. Then that would be a fair case once you prove an example, or you could prove some useful information in the Caribbean. If you're asking me if adding theories isn't necessary, no, I wouldn't say adding a theory isn't necessary. There are theories that are applicable. If you know the theories, you certainly can use it, but you're not going to be fail. You're not going to fail if you don't know, again, Talcott Parsons' theory on the family. You're more so looking at what, showing a knowledge of what is the showing knowledge of the syllabus that you're engaging with, and what are the different Caribbean perspectives. So let me answer this before we get on to the next section. Can Josh just point the link to the Marxist perspective? It could, but bear in mind though, guys, that it's still Caribbean studies and not sociology. Even though this particular topic is linked, you can do well without, for example, trying to throw in Marx in your analysis. Just go back over your textbooks, which are useful, and look at what are the objectives in the syllabus that they wanted to answer. As you noted earlier with the intellectual tradition, they explicitly mentioned Marx. So then you can bring in Marx. In this aspect of the syllabus, that's not so much of a focus. If you look back at the overview where it said, the impact of societal institutions on the Caribbean people, so family forms such as nuclear, extended, visiting. So it's looking at the family forms themselves. So that's the analysis here. That's a level of analysis we're looking at, the family forms, rather than the sociological theories on the family. So just bear that in mind. It's not a sociology essay. It's a Caribbean studies essay. Hence, you're looking at how the Caribbean's family institution function and how that might impact society. All right, so we're going to head into the Caribbean global interactions. This looks at the international dynamic with the Caribbean and its diaspora. And you can see it here, it's also in the syllabus. Previously, when I did this, I had looked at the role of, let me check here if it's still here, I've taken it out. Okay, now I've taken it out. Previously, when I had looked at this, I had looked at, for example, Notting Hill and such. So you can look at the recordings that exist on the YouTube channel for that. But I decided to look on a different question, which is to what extent is extra-regional migration a major loss for Caribbean society? I decided to look at this question because it goes beyond just having an appreciation or knowledge of extra-regional migration in the Caribbean and how that might contribute to the development in countries like the UK or like the US in forms of festival, and more looks at the perspective of migration from the impact that it leaves on the Caribbean. And what I found when looking at this question by examining the subject report was that they said, oh, okay, I was just checking that it's been recorded. So it said that based on the wording of the question, candidates needed to be analytical in their responses. They could identify both benefits and losses to the Caribbean from migration. Most, however, interpreted the question to mean that they should only identify ways that migration is a loss to the Caribbean. The extent to that loss or not was completely ignored. So basically, to these kinds of questions, the 30 question, requires far more analysis than just, for example, the previous 20-mark one, which I asked you to assess something. Sorry, give me 1 minute. Okay. Yeah, so these questions require you to look at more so than just presenting information. 20 marks, usually I'll ask you to present information. This is arguing to take a perspective or take a stand, which is why I put this emphasis. The extent of that loss was not complete, was completely ignored. So let's also see what they said. Another challenge was that most candidates could only identify brain drain as an effect on migration in the Caribbean. Only a few candidates identified other losses, such as a breakdown in family structure or the barrel children syndrome, low productivity, cultural erasure, the feminization of migration, loss of income or revenue for the government of respective Caribbean islands, etc. Only about 10% to 15% of the candidates scored 20 to 30 marks on the question. A significant number scored between 15 and 20 marks, and the rest scored under 15 marks. So you're talking about roughly over half of students scoring under 15 on this question. Poor performance in this question could be due in part to the fact that some candidates could only identify one way in which migration is a loss to the Caribbean. So basically, this question here is asking us to, one, state a position about what is the extent, to a significant extent, to a limited extent, what is the extent of the loss of ex-region migration for the Caribbean society. And then you to show other perspectives. So as some of you have rightly highlighted, brain drain is one perspective, but the essay is not built around just brain drain. It's also built around the other consequences, which we'll now go into. Additionally, you can also benefit some of the benefits, if I can say that, of migration, because this is looking at weighing up of arguments as well. So how do we answer this question? We provide an introduction. We look at the context of immigration from the Caribbean to the rest of the world. So let me use Jamaica as an example in this case. Where the Planning Institute of Jamaica estimates that between 1970 and 2003, 745,000 Jamaicans emigrated to the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, or an average around 22,000 Jamaicans per annum. If you are stuck and you're thinking, okay, how many Jamaicans migrate from Jamaica each year? If you said 20,000 people, you're broadly right. It usually fluctuates between 19 to 22,000 Jamaicans who migrate each year. So a quick, like a simple number you think for context, 20,000 Jamaicans migrate each year. If you look at now the Caribbean region, it says the World Bank estimates that in 1990, the number of Caribbean immigrants totaled more than 2.5 million individuals. In 2020, that number had more than doubled and reached 6.1 million people. So you're talking about Trinidad, which is under 2 million people, there are more Caribbean nationals. The number of Caribbean nationals that have migrated would basically be the equivalent of 3 times the population of Trinidad. Or if you use Jamaica, you're talking about 2 times the population of Jamaica, just to illustrate how widespread the issue of migration is in Jamaica. So that's your context. Important to provide your context. And then you can highlight your consequences, give a basic overview. So for example, it can be argued that this might lead to a loss in talent or brain drain, and also it could lead to big gains, for example, in remittances. However, very important is to declare your position and provide a thesis statement. So for instance, this essay argues that it is to a significant extent, immigration is a major loss for the Caribbean society because it leads to a loss in skilled talent, a reduction in the country's tax base, and let's say reduction in the country's tax base and a disintegration in stable family units, for example. You clearly see from that case study these 3 examples. Once you do that example, you show the counter argument, even though a counter argument could be that remittances is a benefit, and persons would have argued remittances benefits the Caribbean because it contributes to the budget. It leads to a reduction in poverty, as local incomes could be supplemented by it, and you outline the benefits of that. Nevertheless, it still does not compensate for the loss in skill sets that I've outlined for argument. For example, I see someone's hand is up. Let's.
Sir, could the decrease in political representation or political voice or participation in the electoral process be one too? Seeing that you have less persons there to bring forth fairer elections, is that a point?
That could be a point, although I will say it might be a little more difficult to try and prove that point, because firstly, Jamaica is not the Caribbean. And if you look at voter turnout, for instance, in other Caribbean islands, for example, Barbados, it's still quite high, over 60%, while Jamaica is now fluctuating at, I think, 38%. It was at the last election during COVID. So the whole Caribbean loses out from immigration. And there's a lot of persons in the region that are immigrating, but Jamaica's voter turnout has fallen significantly more than the other Caribbean territories, which is why it may be a little bit more difficult to try and prove that argument in an essay. It can be made, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it would be it's not going to be made in the way that you're probably thinking about, saying that, well, because people are leaving, then that's why voter turnout has gone up because there are less people. It's more so that voter turnout is going down because people are less interested in politics and more interested in, for argument's sake, migrating from the country. So they're thinking, okay, I'm done with politics. I'm going to head out elsewhere to find my fortune. So that's how you could do it. But I would probably stay away from trying to prove an argument, which is you can make out into a research paper. I'm more so focused on what are the low-hanging fruits that you can have. If that makes sense. Hope that helps.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. I see another hand up. Is this Marshawn? I really hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Marshawn.
Yes.
Yes, Marshawn.
Yes, good day. Sensible that there's more importation. For instance, person leaving the country, most people leave like children and family members behind, and
We lost you, Marshawn. We're not hearing you.
so they
Yes, Marshawn, we just lost you again.
I was saying high importation.
All right, you're going in and out, Marshawn. I'm gonna ask you if you could just send a message in the group that everyone can see, and then I'll read that out aloud because
For the country that the person leave.
Hey, Marshawn, so you're going in and out. I'm gonna ask you to just type your message in the chat, and then I can address it since that we're not able to hear you consistently. All right, let me hear from Sarah. Yes, Sarah.
I wanted to know that can the loss of sports professionals, like sports athletes from Caribbean countries and coaches and stuff, contribute to the major loss of Caribbean countries, as well as like professionals in terms of like teachers and so forth?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, let me go and find something very quickly, as I think it might illustrate the point about this particular question in mind. So a bit of context: I worked as a journalist before I started going to school overseas, and as a consequence, you really pick up on. I had access to the newspaper's archives of Jamaica, to the Jamaican Gleaner. And just to illustrate this point that we're making about the consequences of migration, there is this article that I discovered in our archives that I will share with you. Can you see the article?
Yes, sir.
All right, so if you look at this article, you will see where it says, "Do not leave, appeal to Jamaican nurses, resist the temptation of higher salaries abroad." And what we found when we looked at this article from the Gleaner, this is from 1965. And when we look at what happened, we see an appeal to young Jamaican nurses to resist for a while the temptation to leave their own people in Jamaica to suffer for wants of nursing care while they go after higher salaries in Canada and the United States, was made yesterday by the Honorable Edward Allen. And the consequence of migration, we saw where the newspaper report that a hospital ward at the Kingston Public Hospital was closed yesterday, and that 3 wards may have to close in order that the standard of patient care might not deteriorate. We see where many of these nurses hold administrative and supervisory posts in England, Canada, and the US, and from elsewhere. A fair number also serve in Jamaica. So what we see here is a consequence of migration or immigration or skilled professionals is that it might lead to the closure of hospitals, or it might lead to understaffing amongst public health institutions. And this also goes for doctors, for teachers, and such. So when discussing the consequences of migration, you can see where you can look at the shortage of teachers and then see what is a consequence of that. That could mean the loss in, that might be lead to loss in learning time. That could be to hospitals having to close because it's happened before. So you can look at those examples as well. Bring up my slides here. Screen. All right, yes, I will share that article in the WhatsApp group. So let me finish the how to respond and then I'll go right back into the questions, or rather the comments that are being here, because they're very useful comments and definitely keep them coming. But let me finish this 1 minute where we see some of the negative impacts of migration could mean immigration results in brain drain, as you've said. The country very often suffers from the loss of many professionals and many skilled personnel. You could look at a breakdown in the family structure or borrowed children. So for instance, a mother might go overseas to work and they send back a barrel or gifts to the child, but the mother is unable to socialize that child in certain values. You can look at low productivity, basically, where it's very difficult to get things done as the country doesn't have people. In the case of Jamaica, Jamaica has labor shortages right now. You'd oftentimes hear the Prime Minister Holness say, well, we really want to have more people working because unemployment has dropped to 4.5% and we need people. But yet at the same time, we see 20,000 Americans are leaving each year. And that has impacted across the Caribbean. Same with countries like Dominica, where I think over half of the population lives outside of Dominica. Guyana also suffers significantly from immigration. So you can look at how this might contribute or hurt the economy. You could look at loss of income or revenue for Caribbean governments. This means, for example, loss in taxes, because these are the productive members of the society that are no longer being a part of the society. They're opting to go somewhere else. In terms of the positives, quote unquote positives, or the counter arguments, you can look at that migration might benefit the country through remittances. So for instance, remittances in the Caribbean is the second, I believe it could be the second largest earner of foreign exchange in the Caribbean. My dissertation here in Oxford is looking at that. And what we found was that I think it was remittances, I think tourism, and then I think mining might be the three highest forms of foreign exchange. Definitely for the smaller countries and Jamaica, it was remittances and tourism. So that significantly contributes to the economy. You can look at potentially the promotion of knowledge exchange. So Caribbean artists might go overseas and might extend Caribbean culture. So if you watch the recent Bob Marley movie, a large part of it took place in the United Kingdom as Bob Marley had migrated to the United Kingdom. A lot of the culture that other countries in the US and the UK have about the Caribbean is usually from these migrants. You can also look at reduction in the pressure on social services. For instance, you have less persons going to school because they've migrated and the government doesn't have to spend as much money. But remember though, to maintain your position throughout your essay. So if you take a perspective that extra-regional migration is a major loss, simply highlighting some of the benefits is not sufficient. It is important that you acknowledge why these benefits do not compare to the loss to the wider region. So basically, to what extent is extra-regional migration a major loss? See, you can underline it. Extra-regional migration or immigration is a major loss. You could say, well, it's a loss, but not as major. Or you could still say, well, it's a minor loss, but basically you have to state your position. Let me see if this, right. So let me go through some of the comments that you have shared here. I wouldn't argue that it is a major loss, but rather a beneficial opportunity. Yes, that argument can be made as long as you justify the argument. All right, you're gonna have to look at justification. So basically the essay is not just sufficient to just highlight it, but basically say, okay, if it's a beneficial opportunity, in what way? I see loss of labor, a trained labor force. Yes, that is important. Could feminization and borrowed children be in one paragraph? It could be. It's really up to you how you structure the essay. But bear in mind, though, that you're trying to also demonstrate an appreciation of the points. So they can be linked, they can be separate, but once you explain it some more. I see there's another question on perpetuation of dependency, also a relevant point that you could add and you can explain on. Also, would identity change challenges or be an issue? Yes, we could argue that, well, when so many persons from the region migrate and are able to enjoy better standards of living than in the region, it creates this idea that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy or continuous cycle of migration. So you can make that point. Yes, it is encouraged that you make points on both losses and benefits, but still take your position, because it still asks you to establish to what extent is this a major loss in society, rather than simply just stating that it's a loss and that there are some benefits, or there are some benefits and there's some minor loss. Examine the extent to which you say that. Can we take the middle ground? Yes, you can take a middle ground, but bear in mind that even if you take a middle ground, still have a position. So what do I mean by this? It doesn't ask you, the previous wording was assess. This doesn't ask you to assess. It asks you to establish to what extent. And the nature of to what extent makes it a lot more difficult to take a middle ground on. Even if you say, well, it's to a limited extent that immigration is a major loss in the Caribbean. And those who argue that it is a major loss say these points, or argue these points, and this is what it means. I say, or this essay says it's to a limited extent because these are the benefits that you can see. But so that still allows you to take a somewhat middle ground perspective, but you still have to declare to what extent you're really working. Let's see. Should you choose to zone in on one particular Caribbean country, would you be penalized? No, you wouldn't be penalized as long as you demonstrate. Or you can simply say that in many ways this is that trend seen across the Caribbean, because it's true. If you analyze St. Vincent and the Grenadines, if you're from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it's highly likely that those migration rates are also going to be seen in an island like Dominica. Similar makeup, similar challenges. Even Jamaica, which is significantly larger than some of the islands in Eastern Caribbean, has these traits as well. So no, you won't be penalized for it. Let's see. Won't they be disqualified from representing another country because of their nationality? I think this might be in relation to the sport in question. If we're going to look at migration, I wouldn't necessarily choose a loss in sporting talent. Not that it can't be justified, it can. There are cases of Jamaicans who have represented other countries. I know Merlin Otti is one. There was also a gentleman who I think represented Japan a few years ago. His name is slipping me right now. But if you're going to look at loss in talent, think of nurses, teachers, doctors. Those three, you won't go wrong with those three. If you're thinking about how this might limit development, you can even throw in engineers as well, because we have a shortage of engineers in the Caribbean, particularly in countries like Jamaica, which doesn't train as many engineers from, let's say, Trinidad, comparatively speaking. Can remittances be a benefit of migration? Yes, it can be. You can make that argument. Let's see, high importation, person sending foreign fluids to the country for family members left behind. Yep, that's also a point that you can make. Let's see. All right, let's see another question here. All right, can you share the article? Yes, I can share the article. If I haven't sent the article by the end of the session, just please send a reminder as well. I have that this importation and remittances can build dependency, and have the family members left behind become unproductive workers due to their dependency. Yes, that is a good point, Sharnessa. In fact, there is a term in economics that we have for it, where basically for countries that receive a lot of remittances, what you see is the disincentive, or persons who might be less inclined to work, because the income from the remittances is higher than the salaries in the labor force. So what you might find is that there are persons who might not necessarily want to enter the labor market or to work, take up formal employment because they receive remittances. And in fact, I'm in the United Kingdom now, and there was a church sister of mine that I spoke to who shared that this was a problem in her family, because one of the reasons why she stopped sending remittances back home to Jamaica was that her family members were more reliant on the remittances than interested in actually going to work. So yes, that is something that you can mention, as long as you explain it as well. Can it increase the rate of social mobility through remittances sent home? Because usually, I feel like this is a rare case because usually migrants have kind of menial jobs, and realistically it may help the financial situation to the extent but not necessarily promote mobility. Just my opinion though. In my opinion, the remittances are not significant enough to change the social class. Agreed with Jada. All right, so really like these. I really like these questions, guys. But let me, and it does prove that you're thinking, but let me complicate the situation a little bit more, because I have this book which recently came out, if you can see it. And I think in this book, it actually argues that remittances was very critical in the 1990s to reduce poverty, I think in the Jamaican context as well. But let me see if I can find it just to show. So it's not so clear cut or as black and white as it might seem in the comment section, but it is, I absolutely applaud the discussions that is currently taking place in the group, and it does show that you are thinking. 228. Let's see here. See here. So this is from, I'll tell you the book, From State to Markets, Journey of the Jamaican Economy, and it came out in the last year, 2023, and this is what it says in the paragraph. Remittance flows in increasing volumes from around the 1960s. Ransford Palmer provides estimates of remittances from the US in the period 1962 to 1972. During the 1960s, Jamaicans migrated to the US mostly for unskilled and low-wage jobs, which paid more than they could earn at home. So bear in mind that due to differences in this, due to differences in exchange rate, even a menial job in the United States would still pay higher than their equivalent in Jamaica. So factor that as well. Migration then composed of two economic groups: domestic workers, laborers, and farm workers, and other professionals and skilled workers. The new class of skilled workers could afford to send back more as remittances to Jamaica. In the 1970s, private transfers to Jamaica were only 0.17% of GDP. By 1990, the net private transfers totaled 9.1% of GDP. According to official statistics, remittances increased from US 130 million in 1990 to nearly US 470 million in 1994. Remittances certainly reduced the incidence of poverty in the 1990s. So it wasn't as clear-cut as to say that, oh, remittances can't reduce poverty or can't increase someone's standard of living, because the data says that actually poverty in Jamaica did decrease in the 1990s, partly due to remittances. It can be argued that that remittances might disincentivize people from working, but like I said, this essay, it does not ask you to have an economic perspective completely unassailable. It's really asking you, or it's really wanting you to think through what are the implications of the arguments that you're going to be made. So you can make arguments for and against. You can show different perspectives. I can argue against this. I can also argue for this. But it's really looking at, are you thinking through these questions? Let's see. Also, I see where there's a question that says, would a negative impact of migration be migrants are more likely to be exploited? Caution, there's a caution here. This question doesn't ask you to look at migration in general. It looks at to what extent is extra-regional migration a major loss for Caribbean society. So bear in mind, it's asking you to look at the Caribbean itself, not the experience of migrants in the United States or Caribbean migrants in the US. So just remember what the question is asking so you don't go too broad in your analysis. I know I had one hand that was up. Cultural loss, yes, it could be one, but it wouldn't necessarily be because the watering down of culture. It would probably more be because, let's say, for instance, many persons from rural islands or the rural parts of islands migrate, so there are certain cultural forms that will be lost as these people leave the island, not necessarily due to commercialization. Yes, sir, I know you had your hand.
Can an argument be that due to the Caribbean diaspora, when they go to these to the metropolitan countries, they carry on their Caribbean heritage, such as like the different festivals in Toronto and so forth. Can that be a counter argument? And then in turn, it increases tourism to come to Caribbean countries to celebrate things such as crop over and carnival and so forth.
Yes, yes, you can make that argument, and I would think that that would be a strong argument once you accompany it with the other points as well. But that is an argument that you can make. Do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions. And we are getting into the recap. So it's now, let's see, 1:20 in Jamaica. I have another section that looks at mass media, but I see where, well, at least in the break, you had persons had expressed a desire to look at essay tips in order to ace these essays. So I'm asking for everyone in the group, would you prefer me to go through mass media now and then go on to the essay tips? Or would everyone more so want me to devote the time that I would spend on mass media and then look at purely just on answering the essay and the best ways to go about answering the essay and structuring arguments? If you would prefer me to look at the mass media, you can just shoot me a message in the chat, and I will look at what's the consensus. If you prefer me to just do essay tips, then you can also say so in the chat. All right, so the majority of you have said that you'd want to see the question on mass media. So let me do the mass media question and then look at the essay tips after, since most persons have expressed that they wanted the mass media. Before I go into mass media, could a counter argument be reduction in sustained in pressure on resources due to migration of Caribbean peoples, thus leading? Yes, you can make that argument as long as you explain it. The most important thing is not just stating things, but actually explaining what you mean by them. So let me do the mass media now, which looks at roles and functions of the mass media, with the syllabus asking for provision of information, entertainment, construction of national, regional, and diasporic identity, promotion of cultural experience and exchange, responding to cultural imperialism, promotion and defense of the rights of citizens. In 2010, the paper, Caribbean Studies paper, was the mass media in the Caribbean is preoccupied with sensational news reporting such as crime and violence, rapes and burglaries, with little focus on the region's economic, educational, and other developmental issues. Give arguments for and against the statement. The exam report had said candidates who provided full responses defined the mass media as both the print and electronic media. Such a definition allowed them to speak to a range of printed text such as newspapers, magazines, and billboards, as well as images such as television, film, and those on the internet. They saw sensational news as news which depended on excess and the extreme, and which captured public attention, such as rape, gruesome murders, and celebrity lifestyles. So how do we go about answering this question? One, definition. Outline your key terms. So definition of mass media, communication technologies used to reach a vast majority of the public. Would make sense. Media, how you're aiming to reach the public. Mass, wide scale. So social media is a form of mass. The newspaper is a form of mass media. Radio is a form of mass media. So you see, you can include print media, broadcast, and digital media. Candidates then debated the value of prime time for radio and television or the front and back pages in newspapers as they determined what was deemed as necessary for the day-to-day reporting of the news as against what was required for the long-term goals of development. So the question asks you to state you're arguing both for and against that. One, the mass media is sensational, and one, it isn't. Once you have your definition, you don't need to define what exactly should be the role of mass media. So if you argue that mass media should be to inform persons of what's going on in society, then from your analysis, you find that actually the mass media is really more reporting on who, let's say, Taylor Swift, for argument's sake, that you find that your local media is more interested in Taylor Swift than, let's say, importance of a national development issue, then you can say, well, yes, the mass media does encourage more sensationalism and matters that are not of importance. But that is if you define the role of the mass media as informing you on national issues. So basically, you need to outline your parameters in the introduction. Definition, look at the examples of mass media, and then what should be the role of the mass media. And then from there, if you argue that the mass media is preoccupied with sensational news, you can look at one, the excessive attention given to murder stories in both print and electronic media. So for instance, you sometimes see it in the newspaper, or not even newspaper, sorry, but in the television news. If you're in Jamaica, television Jamaica, TVJ, I would encourage you to, at least leading up to the exam, watch primetime news at 7 o'clock, or at least read in the newspapers, because that gives you very good examples that you can run, relevant examples that you can look at for your essay. But if you argue that it is concerned with sensational news, you could look at the excessive attention given to murder stories, both in print and electronic media, the existence of newspaper sections devoted to celebrity news. For example, the media features what sells, the poor usage of media to share education and other challenges, or the lack of a forum provided by government officials or for government officials to discuss topical issues. So to give an example, if I have my phone here, if I look at, for argument's sake, the Gleaner, which is Jamaica's national newspaper, the first story that comes up in the latest news section is American man charged for ammunition allegedly found in luggage. Let's see, the sixth story is gun seized to arrested. The other story of a man accused of defrauding overseas job seekers granted bail. So you can see where out of these 7 or so stories, almost half of them are related to crime. So that's why I said that you simply reading the newspapers provide that example. So these are some of the arguments you can say, yes, it is concerned about sensationalism. If you say, well, oops. If you say that it isn't concerned with sensationalism, you can argue that the media is responsible for keeping government accountable and highlighting instances of corruption. So if we look at the same example of the newspapers, in the lead stories, it says the first paper, the first article we see on the newspaper, on the Gleaner today, is taxpayers are bearing the weight of an $81 million and rising salary bill for 7 suspended public officials as a result of drawn-out investigation and administrative limbo within government agencies. So this is the role of accountability. So even in the newspaper, we see where you can have arguments for and arguments against. So I would suggest at evenings, read your country's or listen to your country's news at 6 or 7, or watch it at 7 if it's at 7. Listen to radio in anticipation of the exam, or if that's too much for you, download the apps and newspapers in the Caribbean or media companies in the Caribbean and just look at the news, because that can provide you relevant examples, not only for media questions, but for the rest of the essay. If you argue that, well, the mass media does not encourage sensationalism, you can look at the important role media plays in promoting rights and highlighting stories of abuse. You could look at also the importance of role media in promoting Caribbean identity and culture. So I know, for example, Carnival experienced a lot of attention in the Caribbean region in general, That is important for a tourism product. The media highlights that. So this, you can look at arguments for and against simply by having an appreciation of what's really going on in the media. So what's going on in the media. And yes, this is actually going to be uploaded into YouTube right after. All right, so let's go on to our essay tips. Oh, before we go on to essay tips, I see a question. Can we say due to our culture as Caribbean people, we more use mass media as a tool for entertainment, such as crime and so forth? Yes, we can make that argument, sir. Just have to provide your examples. Any other questions? You can use the raise hand function. And mass media entities have reported outrageous things. Yes, you can. Yes, that is also quite true as well. Yeah, perfect. You have an appreciation then of the arguments for this, Sarah. But also bear in mind the question does ask you to sub for and against as well. So also think of arguments that you can use against that perspective. Do we have more comments or questions? All right, not seeing any of them at the moment. Let's go on to our essay tips, which is the final thing that we'll be doing today. So first tip, 1, define key terms. It is really important you have an appreciation as to what exactly you're arguing. So if you're talking about, for instance, there was a question that came up, I think maybe last year, that, or might have been the year before, GDP per capita is a poor metric to use in the Caribbean. Hence, you need to understand what's GDP per capita, which is the total value of an economy divided by its population. But essentially, whatever you do, look at the key terms, underline them, make sure you define them. You don't need to define things like what and the and it and so. Just highlight the key terms and then break those down. You tend to see maybe 1 or 2 key terms at most. So define your key terms. 2, provide your thesis statement. This essay will be arguing, or the arguments of this essay is, or even though this is an argument that has been made, this essay is making this point, or these are the broad benefits of this and the challenges that will be discussed in these essays. Thesis, it helps to keep you grounded, it helps to keep you fixed as to what exactly you're arguing and that you're not so broad. Your thesis comes at the end of your introduction. 2, or 3 rather, address each point in a paragraph. A challenge I've seen in several of the examiners' reports is that the essays aren't as structured to maximize the ability to understand what is being said. So peel. Someone mentioned in the if you face a challenge with trying to structure your example, use peel. I'm going to make a note of it here, which is point, example, or point, explain, example, link. So, for instance, I saw a comment here about, could we say mass media causes unnecessary fear and emotional distress in watchers from excessive reporting of crime? Let's use that context. And oh, sorry, I said this to someone privately by accident. Thank you very much, Maya, for sharing it with everyone. Let me change these settings. Yes. So let's say we're going to take that example and we say mass media is concerned with sensationalism, or mass media in the Caribbean is concerned with sensationalism. That's our point. We see where in Caribbean newspapers, there is a glorification of violence, an obsession with grotesque incidents of crime and criminality. For instance, newspapers might focus a lot on the gory details of a specific murder, rather than examining what was the motive of a particular crime. This might cause fear and emotional distress in watchers or in those who consume said media, who are constantly being socialized to see images of crime or images of the consequences of crime. Here's a link. Therefore, from this example, we can see where mass media is concerned with glorifying or is obsessed with highlighting excessive examples of violence. So we was able to identify the point, the example, the explanation, and then link it together. The link basically shows how what you have outlined builds on what your thesis statement is. 4, provide real-world examples. Guys, it's not a theoretical paper. Yes, theory is important where it is useful, but it also is useful for providing examples. So to give an for instance, when I did CAPE economics several years ago, I remember that I had used the context of, I think it was Zimbabwe, because we had a question on money, and I had argued or used the example of Zimbabwe having to suspend their currency due to inflation. That was an international example. This is a Caribbean studies paper, so use your Caribbean examples. But that example was very helpful to my essay, and I would argue was very helpful in having me not only place top in my high school for CAPE economics, but placing 5th in the Caribbean. I say this, examples illustrate your point. So definitely use them when you have them, which is why I'm strongly suggesting you in the days leading up to your exam, read the papers, watch the media, listen to the radio, because those examples, you'll be surprised how useful they are in explaining and building your arguments. Also, when stating your points, provide counter arguments. This is important. You're weighing up debates here, and you're looking at what's more persuasive. So providing your counter arguments are essential to maximizing your use of knowledge points. And 6, remember to answer what the question is asking. Too many people might feel nervous and then throw out everything that they know without linking it to what the question is asking. So ensure to remain relevant. Go back to your thesis statement to ensure that you're answering it. 7, in the off chance that you're running out of time, list your points. They will count it. If you say, all right, you're running out of time, you can't develop it, just list it. A, B, C, D. If you have enough time, you can go back to it. If not, just list it, they will count it. Also, how to excel in your exam. 1, do not spend too long on one question. You will see when you open your paper that you will see the paper will basically say there's section A, B, C, and D. Answer all questions. Section A and B, it is not recommended that you take more than 35 minutes on that paper, or that essay. And then C and D, it's not recommended that you take more than 55 minutes on each essay. That comes up to 3 hours. I would suggest, if you have a problem with time, practice, do your own time sessions and practice. I would say that this time gives you 3 hours exact. I wouldn't necessarily say use up all 35 minutes on one question if it's a 20-minute mark question. I would say, broadly speaking, try to do maybe 30 minutes on your question with 2 minutes to plan, or well, that's it. Yeah, 2 minutes to plan what you're saying, 2 to 3 minutes to plan what you're saying, 2 minutes to check over, and then the 30 minutes to write it out. Those are for the 20-mark questions. For the 30-mark questions, I would say you can take broadly maybe 52 minutes or so. No, not 52 minutes, rather 45 to 50 minutes to write it out. Let's say 45 minutes, generally speaking, to write out your arguments, 5 minutes to plan, because these are bigger essays, because they're 30 marks compared to 20 marks. 5 minutes to plan, and then 5 minutes to check over. If you are in your 20-minute essay and you are past 35 minutes, stop the essay, go on to the next one. Because you can actually finish or do, let's say, for example, 3.5 essays, for instance, and do well, actually. There are cases of people who might not finish all the fourth essay, but they had 3 really good essays and a fourth essay which was okay, and they did well. But if you do 2 exceptionally good essays and you 2 essays that you barely even attempt, you're going to struggle. I'm not saying you won't pass, but you're going to struggle. So if, for instance, you go in, you spend 35 minutes on one essay, and let's say you're going on 36 minutes on the other essay, just stop that essay, move on to the next one. If it is that you're at 30 minutes, 33 minutes on the 20-minute essays, and you are thinking, oh my goodness, I'm running out of time or so, just know that there's only so much marks you can get, put that down and go on to the next one. So don't spend these guidelines are at most, don't spend more than 35 minutes on your 20-mark essay. Don't spend more than 55 minutes on your 30-mark essay. In fact, if you can finish them within 30 minutes and 50 minutes respectively, that will be helpful, because the 20 minutes that you get, that you have additional, you can be spent to tighten up your responses, make any corrections, read over your essays. So I would generally suggest you do 30 minutes on the 20 marks questions, 50 minutes on the 30-mark questions, and then keep your remaining 20 minutes either to additional planning or to check over. Because once you have that time to play around with, then it's better for you. Let's see. Ensure to structure your examples. That's important. So show, point, example, explain, link. Be efficient with your responses. Guys, don't ramble. Sometimes students have this problem when they get nervous that they just continue to tap right. So don't do that. Just remember your point. Give your explanation. An explanation isn't a ramble. If you find that you're repeating yourself in a paragraph, you're probably rambling rather than explaining. Give an example and link it all together. Oh, in terms of, I was asked to show the suggested time. I would say do not spend more than 30 minutes at most on your 20-mark essay. For your 30-mark essay, 30 marks essay, do not spend more than 50 minutes. Within that time, it includes 2 to 3 minutes of planning your essays. Planning it is important. And then the remaining 2 or 3 minutes, checking over. Benefit of spending no more than 30 minutes and no more than 50 minutes in both planning and execution of your essays is that you have an additional 20 minutes that you can basically redeploy to finish an essay that you have not finished, or you can use to read over, or you can use to check. So don't, as best as possible, do not go down to the wire with your essays. If you have found that you're gone 35 minutes on your 20-mark essay and you're still writing, just stop. Move on to the next, because there's only so much you can get on one question. So it is better that you have, four okay essays and 2 exceptionally good essays and 2 bad essays. In terms of the time frame, you're working with 3 hours, 4 essays, but bear in mind that the essays are not weighted equally. So you'll have 2 essays that are 20 marks, 2 essays that are 30 marks, which is why I said 30 minutes for the 20-mark essay, 30 minutes for the other 20-mark essay, 50 minutes on the 30-mark essay, and 50 minutes on the other 30-mark essay, because that will give you 20 minutes of additional time. So that's really the timing that I would suggest you have a look at. Also, bear in mind, show knowledge of the course. The course is asking you to show them that you have actually read your stuff. So if we're looking at dependency theory, mention author. It's not mentioned. Show how dependency theory emerged in relation to industrialization by application. Right, so that's how you show knowledge. Lastly, don't panic. I can guarantee you that most, if not all, the essays you can actually engage with if you just remain calm. A lot of this is knowledge that you are familiar with. If you're looking at, for example, let's say you get a question that deals with culture. You know, culture is way of life of a people. You're talking about food, you're talking about dance, you're talking about language, things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So if you're looking at, let's say, for example, The movement of Caribbean people has led to a rich cultural heritage in the region. Discuss with 2 examples, for instance. Then you can look at food. You can look at the Indians with curry. You can look at the African linkage with ground provisions. You can look at dance, for instance. So you look at maybe, let's see, what's an example of a dance? You're the young people. You know the examples of dances that exist. You could look at even festivals as well. Carnival is one such example. So you can see how you can link how the migration of people have contributed to the emergence then of this culture. So that's why I say, just once you think, like, remain calm, you read through the essay for us before you attempt any questions. Then you can start to look at how best to answer these questions. I'd also add, you look at the essays that are the easiest for you so that you can quickly finish them, and then you leave the hard ones more for last. Ensure you go back to the hard ones and don't spend too much on easy questions. So remember the timing. But you don't want to do your hardest question first, because that might lead you to take up too much time and it doesn't fill you with confidence for the rest of the essay. So read through the essay, go for the easiest question to do first. Then if it's a 20-mark question, don't spend more than 30 minutes. 30-mark question, don't spend more than 50 minutes. And then you have the remaining 20 minutes to prepare. And then you should be all set. Do we have any questions? All right, I see one question that says, I usually spend around 40 minutes on both the 20 and 30-mark essays. Is this still an efficient way? It could be. It really depends on an individual basis. If you find that you can do two great 30-mark and 20-mark essays within 40 minutes, then that's also fine as well. Why, for me personally, why I spend a little bit more time on the 30 marks essay, because it generally asks me to do a little more than just assess or explain or give me just give basic information. It usually asks you to do something that requires more analysis, which is why I generally allocate more time to it. But if you find that that works for you, then that also works as well. But bear in mind the differences in marks as well. I was asked earlier if the 20, so there are two modules. There's Caribbean society and culture and issues in Caribbean development. One of them is a 20 mark. You will get 120 and 30 mark for both of them. What do I mean by this? So Caribbean society and culture, you get one essay that's 20 marks, one that's 30 marks. Issues in Caribbean development, one that's 20 marks, one that's 30 marks. Do we have any other questions? Guys, this is the time when you can ask any questions under the sun. Not seeing any questions. Let me leave it open for a few more minutes. Or will the presentation be posted in the group? I don't normally post the presentations. I could, if that's preferred. I normally post them on Instagram. Not Instagram, my apologies, sorry. They're normally posted directly to YouTube. All right, I see where people would prefer me to post it in the group. So I will post it in the group. Let me make a note of that. So I will send presentation to group. I was also asked to send the article on migration, to give an example. I was also asked to send, would you wish for me to also send the picture of the book that I was looking at? All right, let me send a picture of book. And I will also send the cover of the exam revision. The exam revision sessions. All right, I was asked if I have the link of the group. Don't have them immediately here. Let me see if I can. Oh, great. I see where Malika has sent us the Cape Revision Guide for Caribbean Studies, which is one of the really good, really good books. And I would strongly recommend everyone have a look at. Let me download this. All right, let me see if I can find the link. All right, I am not seeing the link here. I'm asking guys if you can just send the link. Oh, the link was sent. Thank you very much, Mayo. So you can go and join the book. Join the group. All right, let's see. Do I have the link for the group? Okay, so the link was sent. There are some topics my Caribbean Studies teacher hasn't completed in Module 2. Will you suggest completing said notes or strictly doing past questions? Complete the notes. Definitely complete the notes. You are being asked to have an appreciation of the whole syllabus as well. So complete the notes. That's very important. Let's see. The book that I was looking in is published. It was published in the United Kingdom, and it's a very expensive book. So I wouldn't suggest you get this just for the one exam. I just read this book just to illustrate the notes on remittances. And if I see any other thing in it that might be helpful, I'll send it along as well. Do we have any other questions? All right, not seeing any more questions. I will be in the group, so you can also reach out in the group, and you can tag my account if you have a tag my number in the message that you send, and I will get right back to you. Sir, can you scan notes from it that can benefit us? I will send photos of this book, but I would more so have a look at the book that was just sent, the Collins Cape Revision Guide. It's really good. I highly recommend it. I will resend it in the group because I know that it was sent generously by Malika. Thank you very much, Malika. So it will be resent so everyone can have access to it. All right, so with that being said, thank you everyone for attending our sessions. It's very happy to have you. Let me go and just show you the links that you can have a look at. So you can follow us on Instagram, or you can reach out to me directly, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. This will be posted to the YouTube channel, so you can have a look at that when it is. And here is the information here. So thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure being here, and all the best with your exams.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
All right, take care, everyone.